By the mid-20th century, the Afrikaners had taken control of this country, South Africa. In 1948, the Nationalist Party came into power, and that's when the system of apartheid was officially implemented. It was absolutely brutal, completely unjust, and most certainly a crime against humanity. But it was also a very, very well-oiled machine, that's for sure. So today we're going to have a look at how that machine worked. We're going to look at the control, the mechanism of control, some of the laws, the removals, forced relocations, creation of the homelands, and that's what we're going to be looking at. And we're also going to be looking at what happened when that machine was handed over in 1994. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you are doing well. And I hope you're enjoying the series that I've put together. And along with me are connecting some of the dots. We know a lot of the information, but if we connect it with more of what we're also doing here, it makes a whole lot more sense as to who the drivers are behind this entire system. So, you all know, if you've been watching me for a while, this is not really a topic I enjoy speaking about. It was never a pleasant time in my history for me at all. So I want to try and describe from my eyes what that apartheid machine actually looked like. I'm not sure what picture the rest of the world had painted. I know the media definitely does blow things out of proportion, so I'm sure a lot of what the rest of the world saw was also probably blown out of proportion at the time. But from what I saw, it was certainly not chaos. As I've said before, it was a very well-oiled machine. Things worked the way they were, and we needed to abide by the laws. Otherwise, you were easily arrested for being a traitor of sorts. And we'll speak a little bit more about that. And I can quite honestly say, I never witnessed as a child random brutality on Black people. I heard about it, yes. I never saw my father or my mother, for that matter, or anyone I knew at all, be brutal towards Black people. Yes, they were your laborers. But in my experience and my life, I was always taught that no matter what, if they were older than me, especially, I had to show respect. And that meant to any adult. And especially our Black staff. So I never saw cops beating up Black people in the streets. Never, ever. We never saw that. I have no doubt that that happened behind the scenes and in the prison system, and absolutely with certain people. I have no doubt about that. But my experience of that was minimal in terms of brutality against African people. But there was certainly a big race class separation. Absolutely, yes. You know, this was a system, and it was a system that was controlled, or rather, shall I say, it was designed to control every aspect of Black life, where the Black people could live, where they could work, who anyone could marry, what we had to learn, or what they could learn, and where you could pretty much die, right? That was completely controlled. So I want to just bring up a little bit of what the control was and how it was done. So where you lived, where you worked, who you married, what you learned, where you could move, your political rights, okay? And it was completely controlled, for example, where you live by the Group Areas Act, the racial zoning of cities and towns, right? Where you worked, the pass laws, the Labor Bureau, influx control, who you married. I mean, mixed marriages were completely prohibited. And I think it was under the Immorality Act or something like that. So if you as a white person were caught cavorting, I'll say it like that, with a darker skinned person, you were arrested, actually. What people learnt, the Bantu Education Act was deliberately about substandard education, where people could move. There were strict pass laws in place. Without a permit, you as a Black person could not be in a white area beyond a certain time. You were permitted in certain areas at certain times. And that's when I often talk about, you've heard me speak about the Dom pass. It was a ID document or a pass that you had to show if you were in certain areas. I mean, political rights, Black people were excluded from parliament. They were citizens of the homelands, not South Africa, but the homelands, which was designated parts of South Africa that certain or the tribes could then relocate to. And that was only African people. The rest was given to, or at least under the authority of the white man, the government, right? Or whoever was behind the government, shall we say. We know that there's a lot more there. But boy, was this machine efficient. And let's also be very clear that it was built on a foundation long before 1948. 1948 is when the Nats came into power and apartheid was I guess South Africa was officially recognized as an apartheid country. But the Natives Land Act from, I do believe, 1913, actually, had already only reserved 7% of this land for Black people. 1913, only 7% of Black people were allowed to own land. The 1936 Native Trust and Land Act expanded that to 13% and then stopped. Black people were not allowed to buy land outside those areas. So they were allowed to own land within specific designated areas. And that was 13% of South Africa. Make this make sense to me, please. So really, by the time that the Nats came into power, or the Nationalist Party, I mean, this structure, this architecture, if you will, was already in place. They just tightened the screws. So again, I want to say to people that the Nationalist Party, or the Afrikaners, or the Boers, if you want to call them whatever, did not start apartheid. That was implemented by the British, going back as far as the 1913 Native Land Act, where only initially 7% of people, Black people, were allowed to own land, and then as much as 13%, kind of doubled, right, of their own continent. So I think we can understand a lot of why there's so much animosity that goes on in this country and on this entire continent, actually. Anyway, so let's look at how to dismantle the next step, which is the machinery of, call it removal, shall I say. One of the things I remember so clearly, and it was brutal, probably one of the most horrific things I witnessed, and I didn't see it live, but you saw a lot of it on television at the time, as it went on, right? And that was the forced removals. So between 1960 to about 1983, more than 3 million Black South Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to the so-called homelands, or ethnic settlements, if you want to call it that. And of course, none of these moves were done voluntarily, were they? I mean, you can imagine nothing was voluntarily done in terms of that. The forces arrived with bulldozers, man. And you would just see these bulldozers dozing these people's homes down. And you just see people running. They were then packed into trucks, these huge, big, bloody dump truck type things, and dumped into places they'd never even been before, let alone seen, just dumped into these homelands. So I want to give you a few of the stats here that I brought up here. So who was removed? Let's talk who was removed. It was the people from black spots, which was African freehold land in white areas. Okay, let's understand what that means. When the whites decided they wanted certain prime land for white suburbs where the money was going to be invested, and if there were black people, tribes on that particular land, that's where they were removed from. And 614,000 people were forcibly removed from black spots and resettled in the homelands. Farm workers and their families were evicted from white farms. That was like 1.129 million people that were removed to the homelands. So again, let's clarify what that means. And again, when certain land was allocated for white farmers, and if there happened to be black families who were settled or lived on that land, and it didn't suit the white farmer, and he bought that part of the land, what happened to the family? Up and removed. Urban Africans endorsed out of cities. Hundreds of thousands. And they were all removed to the homelands. Again, perhaps now, as I've broken it down, we can understand why there is so much animosity. And in fact, I know one area in Cape Town, now that I think about it, Constantia. Now, Constantia has always been a very well-to-do, upper-class white area. And I know that that was one of the areas that a lot of the colored people were forcibly removed from. And I know there's quite a bit of problems in Constantia right now about that, because literally people are moving back into that area and they are squatting, which means they're moving into empty houses or onto empty spaces, and they pretty much have to be forcibly removed. But there's a whole process to get squatters removed. You can't just take them out anymore the way it was done back then. So I know, like, Cape Town is one of those areas that this is happening with, and I'm sure Constantia specifically, and I'm sure if there's any others right now that any of the viewers can speak to on that, I'd love to hear what you have to say. So I want to give you an example here that I actually remember as well. In the Dundee district of Northern Natal, between 1964 and 1970, approximately 12,800 people were removed from black spots like Maria Ratchet's Mission, Boschuk, and Moran. They were taken to a place called Lime Hill. On the first day, the trucks arrived at Moran. The people were told they were being moved. They stripped their houses and loaded their belongings. They were taken 20 miles away to Lime Hill. Yet, when they arrived there, they found Nothing. Nada. Zilch. There were absolutely no houses, no shops, no medical services, no schools, zero. And remember, guys, I've said this before, even in apartheid times, right? Um, Service delivery, etc., was very, very good. So a lot of the African people, there was no um, sewage, overflowing waste, anything like that. This government cleaned up everything. So they were also used to, in their way, nowhere near the way that the whites were, right? But their facilities as well, right? Now they get taken to a place, not a single house, zero, a pile of folded tents. These people had never erected a friggin' tent in their lives before. The first night, heavy rainfall, the tents were swamped, and people didn't know, as I was saying, how to erect the tents, knew nothing about drainage or, I don't know, whatever you need to do when you're erecting a tent that you're going to live in. Each family was allocated a tiny little plot, 50 square yards. No livestock allowed except for chickens. You were only allowed chickens. Now remember, the African people pride themselves on their livestock, their cows, their goats, their sheep. That's their wealth. Suddenly, boom, all of that taken away. You're not just taking away a man's belongings, you're taking away his pride, you're taking away his identity, you're taking away his roots. That's what you're doing. There was no land for plowing. The women who were working sort of prior to that in areas that obviously were close to them, they were able to contribute financially. Yes, I would imagine the majority of them were domestic workers, but nonetheless contributing. We're now unable to contribute anymore because the bus fare was more than what the wages were. 2 years later, Lime Hill still had 76 families living in tents. 2 years later, after being forcibly removed. It became like a slum. And I know it acquired the nickname Mashayazafe. Mashayazafe. And I know that that's Mashayazafe. Mashaya. Beat him until he dies. That's what the meaning of that word is. You know, we can say the government failed us. They did not fail us. They did not fail African people. They were doing exactly what they always intended to do. These homelands were never designed to be viable. In my opinion, they were like designed more to be containers, or dumping grounds for surplus labor, excess people, excuse me, that the white economy no longer needed. And now we know what happens when you put people together in a small environment. no hope, no money, no hope. They've just lost everything. And you contain them in this tiny place. What the hell do you think is going to happen? Okay, how do we reorganize this? The two wings of the same bird. If you watched one of my previous shows called The Monsters, the monster changes faces from white apartheid to black apartheid, South Africa. I speak a lot about this there. So, but I want to bring it in again because it's so important to see the pattern beneath the pattern. Again, let's think about it like this. There's the bird, the apartheid system, two wings, right? So let's look at the two wings of what this bird is. So the wing one would be the Nats, or the Nationalist Party government, and the business community, or the Afrikaner nationalism and the white monopoly capital, right? Political control, economic control. The Broederbond on the one side, right, which is Afrikaans for brotherhood, right? Afrikaans brotherhood is, hang on, I've got to take a, hydrate. My throat couldn't take that anymore. The Broederbond, and then you have that, the one big wing of the bird, and then you have Anglo-American, the Oppenheimers, De Beers, all the mining houses on the other side, right? They were never separate. They were the two wings of the same bird. It cannot be another way. Think about that. We've spoken about that before. It's like the government provided the laws, right? The past laws, the land acts, the forced removals. The business community provides the labor, cheap, controlled, disposable. The mining houses, the farms, the factories, all of that relied on the apartheid system to keep the wages low and the control extremely tight. This is how it all fits together. The bird flew in the one direction, the handle or the controller, right? Or the controllers behind it. And the homelands, they were not just for dumping surplus labor or surplus excessive people, humans. They were also there for what I would say political containment. The government's plan at the time was to give the homelands their independence, making them separate countries with their own governments, their own citizenship. That way, Black South Africans could also be told they had political rights, just not in South Africa. If you think about it, the Transkei was gained its independence in 1976. That's when the Transkei became independent. Bophuthatswana gained its independence in 1977. Venda in 1979, and the Ciskei in 1981. But the reality actually was different. Let's think about, or let's talk a little bit about, not just think about anymore. We're talking about what this reality is. Because for me, the truth of the matter is, it was a dumping ground, like, right? It was certainly not economically viable. For who? Again, in my opinion, it was a complete tool for political containment, and it was definitely not democratic or a democracy in any way. And it was in my opinion, just another way to deny Black people South African citizenship. Because now you're not a South African citizen, you're a citizen of Transkei or Venda or Ciskei or whatever it is, right? And there was no independence in that. The homelands were not viable. And remember, these guys would never have given the homelands to the Black people if they were these massively rich or whatever pieces of earth. Actually, perhaps they were, perhaps they are, but in my opinion, then, and this is just something that's popping in, of course, they would have then set up deals with the royal families or the elders or whatever in the area to get mineral rights there. But anyway, perhaps we'll still get to that. Ah, so frustrating. I don't know if you South Africans remember this or if any of you feel the same way that I do about this. But I mean, when we look at the manipulation, but also, for me, sitting back here and remembering, I mean, I was a teenager, right? A child and a teenager through most of this. But the sense of such an unjust system just burned me to the core. But it felt like there was nothing I could do. And now, when we have come a few decades later and these things start revealing themselves, the truth starts coming out, we can start seeing. I know now my intuition and my suspicions were never ever wrong. And I think that's what gets me so mad, actually. Because as I was saying, they were not viable. They were certainly not capable of supporting the amount of people who were forced to live there. They were completely overcrowded, completely underdeveloped, and 100% dependent on South Africa's economy. Of course they were. Wow. A CIA report from 1970 noted that the Bantustans, even under the more optimistic assumptions, will not support the population intended to be settled there. This was always been the design. If you guys have been watching from the beginning, this has always been the plan from when the Dutch started settling. Okay, let's look at the choice. How do we choose? And what does this mean for the pattern? Again, let's just go back to what we know. The apartheid machine was super efficient, like a well-oiled machine. Brutal, man, cold, heartless, built on laws, violence, deliberate impoverishment of millions of people. Millions. But it was also a machine, and machines can be handed over, right? So in 1994, the Nationalist Party handed over power to the African National Congress. Apartheid was officially dismantled, and the entire world celebrated with us. I mean, a couple of years before that, Mandela came out of prison. We were the Rainbow Nation. We were going to be uniting, right, in the most amazing ways. But let's look at this machine, and let's again look at the pattern. It was not destroyed, was it? It was inherited. And if we think about what that means, the same economic structures remained, didn't they? The same concentration of wealth. Who runs this country? Is Cyril really the president? Well, for those of you who haven't dived down that rabbit hole yet, that's another one we definitely have to dive down then, right? We have already. Anyway, this entire system was never designed to work for everyone. Absolutely not. I mean, as I was saying, it was the same concentration of wealth, the same spatial patterns, the townships, the homelands, the absolute separation and segregation of black and white people. This entire system was built for extraction, and again, never designed to work for everyone. Designed to work for the white people, yes, not the black people. And then the people who received or inherited this system had zero experience running it. Now, again, and I've mentioned this before, when your majority people has been brutalized in the way that apartheid brutalized African people in this country, and of course, poverty being the name of the game, right? Because always the Western carrot dangled in front of African people's noses. Remember, African wealth and Western wealth are two very different things. But of course, the Western wealth, so to speak, is very alluring, wasn't it? So, of course, poverty. I mean, when you're in poverty and you've struggled, you've watched your ancestors struggled, you've only known struggles in your life and brutality. And suddenly you get handed over the system. No handover, no bridge, no sensible period of handing over a system to people that have never, ever had any experience in running a country, or never mind a country, a business. Remember, they weren't even allowed to operate as businesses. So now we have this massive country, and it's interesting because I remember some of my friends saying to me, or people I knew, that even though certain parts of the country, I mean, the roads were deteriorating, everything was deteriorating. And it's not like the people in charge was squandering the money, but they didn't have the knowledge of how to create a budget and spend the money accordingly. So the money was staying in the budget and not being spent, while a lot of the areas were deteriorating. So it's not like there was always and only corruption, but also complete lack of knowledge and lack of understanding of how to run a country efficiently. That's for sure. And remember, built for extraction. What better way than to say, well, here it is, this well-oiled machine, and hand it over to a 12-year-old boy who has no idea what to do, but is going to pull everything apart and just to see what makes it work kind of thing, right? It's the same kind of analogy. So again, this well-oiled machine becomes like a rusted hulk of metal. Corruption becomes the operating system. And of course, I'm pretty sure there was corruption before. In fact, there was no doubt that there was corruption before. But I always say at least the gnats took the cream. They left a lot for the rest of the country as well. They didn't take everything for themselves. Anyway, but that's just part of, how the system obviously has worked. So the state, as I've said before, was hollowed out. Like a hollowed out system. The monster has changed faces, but the architecture of the monster is still the same. So let's sit with that for a minute, shall we? I think it's so important for us, especially as South Africans, no matter what skin color you are, we are all here at this time for a purpose and a reason. And I think it's so important that we do understand the true history and that we do understand that in this democracy that we're living in, it's controlled and run by very, very wounded people. We understand here as well. We talk about ancestral wounding, ancestral curses, that sort of stuff, right? How do we expect when the parents and the grandparents of the current people in power, despite what I personally feel about them, would have come in here glinting with the slick way of running a very, very challenging situation? The more I look at it, the more I see it was designed to fail like this. Like, there's the beautiful toy, but you have no idea how to play with it, but I won't teach you either. So you go mess it up on your own. Anyway, let's look at how we're going to progress over the next few weeks with more of this. And in the meantime, decode, dismantle, reorganize, and choose. So as we see this in our own personal life, we can see it in our country as well, how this works. And do I have the answers of what the solutions are? No, I really don't. But I think it begins with an awareness that we live in a very wounded country and the people are very wounded. We can't expect wounded people who've never had their wounds healed in any way. And it doesn't matter who's responsible or who isn't. It is what it is right now. To progress in a healthy manner. So I do believe that just by understanding that, and maybe acknowledging that when next we encounter these kind of racial confrontations, that yes, there has been a lot of pain in our country, both sides, and the way that we're going to move together as one is through understanding and realizing at the end of the day, we all bleed red. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time. God bless you all and take good care of your beautiful selves. If this broke something open, if you recognized yourself in the testimony, if your body responded before your mind understood, the next step isn't more information, it's pattern work. Decode what your nervous system built to survive. Dismantle the story that keeps it running. Reorganize through the body and choose, actually choose, from the person you're becoming, not from the pattern that formed when you were too small to choose. That's Solutions, link below. The body is the record. Let's listen.